Karmelo Anthony's new team of high-powered lawyers are going scorched earth on the judge who oversaw the teen's trial that ended with him being convicted of murdering fellow athlete Austin Metcalf at a track meet.
He put his hands on me. I told him not to. He put his hands on me.
We have the hundreds of pages of documents claiming the judge overseeing the trial made some major errors. Now, Anthony's team is calling for the guilty verdict to be thrown out entirely. We will also talk about an alleged off-the-record deal that Anthony's defense team made with prosecutors that his new lawyers say set the now convicted teen killer up for failure. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. One of the big questions coming out of the trial of Karmelo Anthony was, why didn't he testify? It is rare for a defendant in a case like that, a self-defense case, to not take the stand in their own defense and tell their side of the story. Now, Karmelo Anthony's new lawyers are shedding some light on what allegedly happened behind closed doors during the trial. It is all part of the roughly 200 pages they filed, and they make some shocking claims as they are trying to get Anthony a new trial. Here are the dozens of pages filed in court in Texas by Anthony's new legal defense team. Last month, the Stand with Karmelo Coalition announced 6 big-name Texas lawyers would be taking a fresh look at the case and trial that ended in a guilty verdict. Now, I will say you can read through these documents word for word, page for page for yourself on our Law&Crime Plus app. Just go to the Karmelo Anthony case file. But let's walk through what these documents tell us, including what the new team is claiming the judge did after the trial that shows, they say, Karmelo didn't get a fair shake. Now, the judge's name is John Roach, and he did not allow cameras in the courtroom or audio recording for the trial. Testimony lasted 4 days, and this trial went at what many have considered a pretty brisk pace, which is part of Anthony's appeal. Now, I'm going to run through what happened in this case very briefly.
I'm not alleged. Okay.
This is the body cam video from one of the first officers who confronted Karmelo Anthony after Austin Metcalf was fatally stabbed. Anthony stabbed the fellow track star during a high school track meet in April of last year outside Dallas in Frisco, Texas. Now, here is the very blurry video of the incident. It was shot from a surveillance camera on the top of the football stadium. It shows some commotion, shows a potential shove from Austin Metcalf, but the moment in question, the stabbing of Austin Metcalf, is something you really cannot see. But this surveillance video was big evidence at the trial. Anthony was reportedly under Metcalf's team's tent. Metcalf wanted Anthony to leave. Anthony did not leave, and then Metcalf shoved Anthony, and in that moment, Anthony pulled a knife out of his backpack and fatally stabbed Austin Metcalf once in the chest. The jury took roughly 3 hours after hearing testimony to reach a guilty verdict. In the days after the verdict, Karmelo Anthony filed a notice that he would be appealing the verdict, and these filings appear to be the first step in that process. Now, there were 2 documents that were filed. One is calling for a new trial. The other calls for the judge who oversaw the trial to be recused from any future proceedings on this case. So I want to start with why this team believes that Karmelo's guilty verdict should be tossed. Anthony's lawyers are arguing that his 6th Amendment right to a public trial was violated. They say that this case received national attention, and yet the proceedings, they argue, were kept out of public view. Audio and video recordings were not allowed. We couldn't live stream it. We were only getting reports from a small number of credentialed media members inside the courtroom, and we were able to have one of those reporters, Cody Thomas from Court TV. But as far as the public, we did see lines out the door throughout this trial, but for the public, there were roughly only 24 seats in the courtroom. Dozens of people lining up outside. There was an overflow room, the appeals attorneys argue, but they say that room was eliminated. Now, in the document, Anthony's team also has anecdotes from people who traveled from places like North Carolina and Arizona in hopes of witnessing this trial, but they say they weren't allowed in. Now, the decision not to allow cameras or live streaming and audio recording, that was made by the judge. And this is what that judge said in an interview with WFAA television after the verdict.
I'm doing this interview with you to make sure that people understand how the system works. And if they really wanted to, and I mean this seriously, if they wanted to, they could have stood in line with everybody else.
We're going to talk more in just a moment about the issues that the Anthony team now has with Judge John Roach and what he had to say in that interview. A big part of this trial also was the fact that Karmelo Anthony didn't testify. Many people have wondered what went into that decision. If he was so scared for his life, why not tell the story on the stand? According to Anthony's new team, a lot of it had to do with what they say was an off-the-record understanding between the defense and prosecution. So this is what it says. Anthony's appeals team said in May of this year, the lead prosecutor on the case reached out to the defense and proposed they, quote, try the case clean. And that would mean they would make this case only about what happened under the tent instead of offering character or reputation evidence. Now, that deal was off the record. And they say the reason for that was so the media wouldn't get word about it because it's probably something we would see in court filings or through local media reports. Now, Anthony's team says that his defense was then limited under that deal at every stage of the trial. They say the defense could have presented statements that trial witnesses made to police, like saying that Austin Metcalf was, quote, kind of like the aggressive guy on the team. They say that there's a student who told police that Austin would get, quote, triggered. And they also say that there's a witness who told police that Austin and his twin brother Hunter refused to be disrespected. They also say under this off-the-record agreement, the defense didn't bring any expert witnesses who could have talked about how Karmelo Anthony's epilepsy could have impacted his perception of threat, or how the fact that he has an adolescent brain, he was only 18 years old when all of this happened, how his brain wasn't fully developed, and that may have impacted his ability to have a fight or flight response. Now, the truth is, we don't know if that was presented. Would that have changed anything in jurors' minds? They reached a verdict after 3 hours of deliberations. Now, here is where Anthony's new team says the off-the-record deal restricted him from being able to testify, because they claim that the plan was for Karmelo Anthony to testify about the altercation that he had with Austin Metcalf, and under this deal that they say exists, that he wouldn't have to worry about his character being attacked on the stand. But then they allege on June 8th, which is the second to last day of this trial, the day before Anthony would have taken the stand, the team alleges that prosecutors went back on the deal. They say that the deal never contemplated a testifying defendant, and they also claim that the defense opened the door to character testimony because in the opening statements for the defense, they mentioned that Karmelo Anthony liked to play chess, which had nothing to do with what happened under the tent. They say, quote, when the moment came for the defendant to make the most consequential decision of the trial, whether to waive his Fifth Amendment privilege to testify, the court allotted the defense 10 minutes to counsel a 19-year-old through it and denied counsel's request for additional time. The Anthony appeal team also talks about the speed at which this trial moved, which did include a full day of testimony on a Saturday. They also mentioned that the jury was told that they would be sequestered to a hotel if they didn't reach a verdict that day. Not only is the new team of lawyers for Karmelo Anthony arguing that his guilty verdict should be tossed, they say that the judge who oversaw the case should be recused from future hearings. Now, a big part of that argument has to do with this interview that Judge Roach gave to WFAA after the verdict.
Did the jury get it right?
Yeah, they did. You know why? Because they were picked based upon the law. They listened to the facts that happened here in this very courtroom, and they got a verdict. And so that's the process. And whatever they say, they get it right.
The appeals team says that Roach is biased to his court's ruling by making that statement, and he should not be allowed to oversee any sort of proceedings related to the Karmelo Anthony case going forward. They mention 5 specific quotes from that interview in the filing that they have brought forward. Karmelo's team also points to this letter that the judge posted on the Collin County, Texas website, where he writes, quote, regardless of title or assignment, each of you contributed to ensuring that the process was conducted fairly, safely, and with the dignity our citizens deserve, end quote. Anthony's team is arguing that anyone who read that letter or maybe watched that interview that the judge gave could reasonably question whether Judge Roach can fairly review a verdict he has already defended as just. Joining us now from Texas to talk more about this case is trial attorney Bridget Williams. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. Reading through roughly 200 pages, the part that stood out to me was this off-the-record deal, allegedly, that the prosecution and the defense made, that the defense and prosecution wouldn't bring in, the character part of the trial, that they'll keep it to what happened in the tent. First off, just how common is it to have those type of deals in cases like this?
It's pretty common to happen in criminal cases like this, or even in misdemeanor cases in trials, where defense counsels and prosecutions will have agreements that they say, well, I won't talk about this as long as you don't talk about that. However, the enforceability is what we're talking about here. And is that something that they can rely on, that says that it forced him not to testify, and then it raises grounds for a motion for a new trial? A lot of times, like what Judge Roach said here in his response to that, well, is it enforceable? Was it something that was presented before the court? Did the court agree on that? Was it something that was written down that was presented to the court? And in this situation, it wasn't. Even in the motion for a new trial, it states, well, it was unrecorded. It was an unrecorded evidentiary agreement, and that's the issue.
Yeah, and I know they said that this was a deal that was negotiated through like phone calls, and I don't know what type of record there may be with that. What did you make of, especially when it came, and that's been a big question, I think, since this trial concluded, was why did Karmelo Anthony not testify? And the idea that they paint the picture in this document that there was 10 minutes to make this decision, and that was all the time they had. They couldn't get more time. And then apparently the day prior, the prosecution says, hey, we may have had this deal for all the witnesses, but this unwritten, off-the-record deal did not include the defendant. What did you make of that part? And I think in the scheme of this being an appeal going forward, how could that factor into the efforts that this team for Karmelo Anthony has going forward?
Yeah, I think that they had to make a decision based off of the information that they were presented during trial. Sometimes in a trial, so many things come up for the defense counsel as you are learning about them as the trial continues on. And you have to make a decision on the spot based off of the information that's presented to you at the time. And at this time, the information that the prosecution had presented to them shown in court, the defense counsel stated that they believed that it wasn't the right decision for Karmelo Anthony to testify in this situation. Whenever a defendant does testify, it does typically open the door for the prosecution to ask them questions about their history, ask them questions about a number of things. And so it is a decision that the defense counsel has to make. They may have tried to prep him prior to that. They may have decided that, okay, well, maybe he was going to testify, and then decided during the trial that that wasn't a good idea anymore during that 10-minute time period. So I think that there's so much that can be determined during a trial, and the defense counsel has to make that decision on the spot. It's a hard job to do.
It is. And I mean, being a defense attorney is just an incredibly difficult job, especially, I'm sure, in a high profile case like this one. I think you could look at, with just how the case played out, that this deal may not have been the best decision to go forward with. I think that there could be a lot of criticism of that if all that's being alleged here is true. Does it reach the bar? If this was a bad decision that this defense attorney made to go into a deal, and we're not going to include like what the appeal lawyers say as far as experts being brought in, apparently Karmelo Anthony has epilepsy. Could that have been something that would have had an impact on his decision-making at 19, 18 years old? He doesn't have a brain that's been fully developed. That's not an argument that was made, they say, because of this. Does that reach the bar, though, in an appeals process for an ineffective assistance of counsel claim?
Well, the ineffective assistance of counsel claim by an attorney, it's a high threshold for someone to reach. And what it's deemed to be is that if the attorney had done something differently, if they had presented this evidence, if they had done these things, then the outcome would have been different. They have to show that the outcome would have been different if the attorney had done those things. And so is it a concern? Is it something that could be raised? Possibly. Do we know that it would make it to the point of like, we know that the outcome would have been different if those things had been presented? We don't know.
Yeah, and that of course is just one part of a couple points that the appeals lawyers for Karmelo Anthony bring up. One of them, and this was a controversial decision, was the no cameras being allowed in the courtroom, no audio recording was allowed in the courtroom. This case was not live streamed. It was a relatively small courtroom. I think there was 24 seats that would be available for members of the public. There were a handful of reporters, like for Court TV and for us here at Law and Crime, we had one of the seats in there, but they argue that this violated Karmelo Anthony's Sixth Amendment rights because he has a right to a public trial, and they say this was not that. Of course, we see in some states cameras aren't allowed at all. States like Florida, you see cameras all the time. What do you make of that? How strong of a claim might that be in an appeal process?
The rules of Texas civil procedure lay out and they govern this motion for new trial and for the motion for an appeal. And when they are doing those things, they're considering a number of factors. One of those factors is, are there procedural irregularities that impact the fairness of the trial? If a judge removes the opportunity for the public to be involved with the case, to come in to an open forum, because that's what it should be, an open forum for the public, then that's a problem. That can impact the fairness of the case. And like it says in the motion, it violates his Sixth Amendment rights. And so it is something I think that they have a chance at least being heard on this motion for a new trial, because there's not enough room in that courtroom for everyone that was there. My understanding is that there were lines out the door. There were several people who couldn't make it into the courtroom. And like you stated, there was room, there was actual seats that were already assigned for media. There were seats already assigned for the defendant's family. There was seats already assigned for the prosecution's family. So that even limits it even more for individuals of the public. So it wasn't enough space in that courtroom for members of the public who actually wanted to be involved, to see what was going on, to hold the court accountable, because that's what the whole purpose of that is. So that way it can be held in the general public.
In a lot of these big cases, we'll see overflow rooms because, there's, I'm sure, thousands of people who would have liked to have been in the courtroom for that. But just with the size of courtrooms, like oftentimes you can't accommodate every person. What typically, though, and I guess that overflow room was eliminated according to the appeal that was put in there. I think of other high profile cases. It was a federal one, but with like Diddy, there was a huge crowd outside the courthouse every single day. There was no way you were going to be able to fit every single person who would have wanted to be in the courtroom. Like, what though is there like a number of seats or something that could, I guess, in the argument is like 24, just like I've been in courtrooms before, obviously, but like, how does that work where on one hand, you probably can't accommodate every single person with just the size of a courtroom, but then at the same time, still making sure you reach the bar that the public had the right to be there?
Yeah, and that's something that it's controversial, but it's up to the judge's discretion. And the judge has to make that determination on, okay, well, is this something that is still being accurately depicted to the members of the general public? And so that's up to the judge's discretion. And he made the decision on that prior to, the trial even getting started. They had a gag order in place. They had several things in place that kind of just limited the public's eye on what was going on. And so it's the judge's discretion on what can be allowed into the courtroom and what cannot be.
The judge gave an interview to a local television station in Dallas in the days after this verdict. That seems to be a cornerstone of the argument where Karmelo Anthony's team wants him recused from any future proceedings involving this case. He made some statements. He said he believes that the jury got it right. Kind of the context there is it seems like the way he was saying that was they got it right because it was a jury that was picked fairly and he stands by the verdict. But I guess how often, I know these are elected positions and people should know who these judges are, but were you surprised that the judge did an on-camera interview about this in the days after this verdict took place?
Well, what I'll say is that whenever a trial is over, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is over. It can still be pending if the person is convicted right, and they have sentencing, then there's still a time frame that is allotted for defense counsel to have a motion for a new trial, 30 days. And so if a person that is involved in this case, a judge, a juror, any person that is making public statements about it, they're still doing it on a pending case. This case is still pending. It's not completely done for. You haven't given the opportunity for the defense counsel to raise their motion for a new trial yet. And so I think that the statements may have been premature. And it also gave personal beliefs as to what happened. And like you just stated, well, the jurors got it right. Even if that was stating that they were picked fairly and everything was done fairly, you still are saying a personal belief that they got it right. And then I think there was further commentary that stated that that Mr. Anthony would now know the consequences of his actions. That's still another personal belief. And so once you start making statements about personal beliefs into this case, you're no longer non-biased. You are inserting a bias into the case, and you're doing it publicly on a local television station.
Right. And it is, they bring up a point in this motion that was filed where could a member of the public look at this, and here's someone who says that he stands by the verdict that happened in his courtroom, but then if he were to be the one to look at, oversee proceedings going forward, that might overturn that. I don't know how much of this would impact, the jury, but of course that's, impossible to know. They make an argument. How do you know that he wouldn't be biased in the direction of the decision that he felt was right coming out of that trial? What happens now? And I know, we read through the 200 pages, they're, making all of these different points. Karmelo Anthony, of course, is waking up every day in prison. The Metcalf family dealing with the loss of their son. Now that this has been filed, and I'm sure that there's going to be other points that'll be brought up by this team working for Karmelo Anthony, how does the appeal process go from here?
Well, the next step is the ruling on the judge's recusal. So he can voluntarily recuse himself if that's what he so chooses to do, and then it'll be assigned to another judge in Collin County. If he does not recuse himself, then it has to be forwarded to another judge who will then have a hearing on the merits. And then the judge will determine based off of that hearing if it is something that needs to go to another judge to be ruled on. And if so, another judge again will be determined to be the person who makes the rulings on the procedures going forward in the case. Now, is this something that happens tomorrow or the next day? I don't know yet. Probably not. These things in our legal system can sometimes take a little time. But it is something that's probably the next steps that'll be going forward.
When it comes to the request to throw out the guilty verdict, and recently people may think of Alec Murdaugh, that took a couple of years to get to the point where he was getting a new trial. What's the process to eventually get to the point where you have a body of judges that make the decision of whether or not his guilty verdict can be thrown out?
Well, like you said, even in that Alec Murdaugh case, it can take years for something like that to happen. So the first step, though, again, is this motion for new trial. Motion for new trial just means that a trial court judge reviews over what happened, and they can have a new case. If there is, let's say there was a legal error in the first case, there is new evidentiary evidence that can be presented in a new trial, or there was some type of procedural issue that impacted the fairness of the case, which is what they're arguing here. But if that motion for new trial is denied, then the appellate attorneys can appeal it to the higher court. The appeals to the higher court are the ones that generally take a long time. And that's what happens when it can be extended out for years and years. That process is not a turnaround process.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens next. Of course, a lot to take in there through the roughly 200 pages that were filed. And I'm sure just the very beginning when it comes to this team now representing Karmelo Anthony working on the appeal process. We'll see what happens next. Trial attorney Bridget Williams, always great to have you here on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, again, just before we go, because there is a lot to take in, roughly 200 pages, very important documents. If you are interested in the case of Karmelo Anthony going forward, you can read them word for word and page for page on the Law and Crime Plus app. and you can make a decision for yourself on where this case should go next. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law & Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we are also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.